including specifically how my office is intending to handle the arrest of protesters. Now that we're prepared to announce a decision in many of those cases, I invited these pastors to join me here today to discuss my decision and to get a head start on tonight's conversation. There have been protests in our community for more than 2 weeks now. I'm glad to report the vast majority of the protests have been peaceful, and even as the protests have grown in number, they've continued to be peaceful. As I've said before, protests are vital to our democracy. They provide an outlet for anger and frustration, they give voice to the people, and they can inspire change. Now, I've been asked many times over the past couple weeks whether we intended to file charges against people who were arrested for protesting, and it would have been improper for me to make any decision in any specific case without having reviewed all the relevant facts and evidence in each case. My office has been reviewing over 200 cases in connection with protests that began the night of Saturday, May 30th, including 67 arrests by Tampa Police Department for unlawful assembly on the night of Tuesday, June 2nd. In each of those 67 arrests, the evidence shows that the person arrested was peacefully protesting. There was no violence, there was no vandalism, there was no attack on a law enforcement officer. Therefore, this office will not be filing charges against any of those 67 individuals. Additionally, we'll be working with law enforcement to expunge the arrest from each of those persons' records. I've said many times that criminal justice reform involves viewing each case not as a person to be prosecuted, but as a problem to be solved. In these unlawful assembly arrests, there's no value in filing charges. Prosecuting people for exercising their First Amendment rights doesn't solve problems, it creates them by weakening the bonds that exist between law enforcement and our community and by undermining people's faith in our system. I do want to make one thing clear. While we have no intention of prosecuting people who are peacefully protesting, we will not tolerate people looking to exploit this moment. There's no place for violence or destruction that creates a risk to the citizens of our community, including law enforcement. As so many in our community unite to stand against racial injustice, we will prosecute anyone who's taking advantage of the opportunity in order to act selfishly, to commit crimes for personal gain, or to cause destruction. I want to close with one important point. We owe it to those engaging in peaceful protest to listen to them. Their messages of frustration and their ideas for change need to be heard, and many of them merit action. I promise to continue listening and to continue working to reform and make progress in our system that we can all be proud of. I'll be happy to take questions, but first, I'd like to invite the pastors here to speak, starting with Pastor Larry Roundtree.
Thank you, Mr. State Attorney. As a Christian leader, I must obey the word of God, which instructs us to cry aloud and spare not. When we were informed of the arrest of these peaceful protesters, I, along with many other clergy in Tampa, rallied together to speak on behalf of the people. The people need to know that the church stands with them as they peacefully protest to call attention to systematic racism and injustice in our society. While we thank the state attorney and his office for being so diligent in dropping these charges, we understand that we are not celebrating as if we finished a race. This is a milestone in a lifelong marathon. We're not going to stop with this. As the state attorney referenced, we're going to be meeting with government officials tonight, members of clergy and the African American community, to engage in continual dialogue to make sure that we improve policing in our communities, improve communication between our community leaders and our government officials and appointed officials to make sure that we can have a peaceful society that is fair and just for all of its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, the State Attorney Andrew Warren for the opportunity to be able to come and be a part of this this announcement, which is, I believe, is the right move. I know it's the right move, the right thing to do, and it is in the best interest of those who are protesting, and also in the best interest of the community at large, that we do engage in conversation, that we do engage in dialogue, and that we do hear each other out. And it is because of that the state attorney listened, and we responded. As Pastor Larry Roundtree, we sent him and some of the other elected officials a letter of outline items that we wanted to address, and one of them was to include the release and not to prosecute any of those who were protesting on June 2nd, because some of them were, many of them were faith-based members who were out protesting peacefully, and I think at midnight, that's when it was called an unlawful assembly. And so as a result of that, 68 of them were arrested. And today is a good day to say, because of the ongoing dialogue, the ongoing conversation, that the state attorney listened, and therefore between he and I believe the sheriff and also the police chief came to an agreement with us. And so that's why we're here today, is to stand in support and in solidarity of this measure, this action being taken. As we move forward, there'll be other discussion and dialogue that we'll continue to have with the elected officials in this community, with the powers to be, so that we can make sure that as we move forward, that we heal our city, we heal our state, and we heal our nation. So there'll be ongoing dialogue and discussion. So again, thank you for this opportunity, State Attorney.
Thank you again, Attorney Warren, and to Pastor Roundtree and Bishop Scott. As they both alluded to, this is really just a mile marker in a long journey for all of us. And I would simply use the terms of unfinished business. We are not done. Pastor Roundtree, myself, Bishop Scott, and many other pastors that are not here today are simply representatives of individuals that may not have a voice themselves, may not have influence themselves, may not have access to the conference room or to the table themselves. And we want to speak on their behalf, and today we hope that we are speaking loud and clear. As has been mentioned, members of the faith community are fully marked and present in this conversation. But this is all of us have felt the tension, and we recognize that there are some tough decisions to make in front of us. Candidly, every elected and appointed official should feel a little uneasy in this moment because we need to be able to not only make some hard decisions, but have some hard conversations. And platitudes, political statements, and divisive statements are no longer going to work. We need reconciliation. We need repentance. We need individuals to be able to come together and move towards real solutions. We are simply here as representatives of a larger message that the unfinished business is right here before us. And as long as we can make progress, I believe that all of us are committed to doing that together. So thank you so much.
Happy to take any questions. We wanted to review each of the criminal report affidavits and the arrest reports to see whether there was any allegation of any wrongdoing outside of peacefully protesting. We were able to determine after a diligent review of each of those 67 cases that there were no allegations or evidence to support that anyone had done anything wrong other than being present during a peaceful protest.
They were arrested because they broke the curfew? Is that safe to say?
No, they were arrested for the crime of unlawful assembly. An unlawful assembly has 3 elements. Essentially, it is 3 or more people who are gathered together with the intent to commit a crime, which can be disruption of the peace or any more serious crime than that. In these cases, however, there was no evidence that anyone was intending to commit a crime. They were there simply to protest. And I've reviewed the files personally. I've looked over video evidence. We've talked to witnesses who were there in my office. People have been asking, well, how come it took so long? Well, It took us a week to get a lot of the files, and we've been working through the weekend to make sure we've reviewed all 67 of these cases as part of the more than 200 cases we've been looking at just in the first few days from the protests. So
Is there some sort of disconnect between the training of these officers? If you review the cases and the law is that they were not to be charged with anything, then why do you think that there's a disconnect between 67, 68 people being charged that night?
well, let's be clear, no one was charged with a crime. Sure. And it's an important distinction, and it's important for people to understand how the legal system works. Law enforcement makes the decision to arrest. Prosecutors decide whether to file charges, if so, what charges, and how to prosecute the case. And different agencies have different standards as well as objectives. We play different roles in the criminal justice system. The fact that a prosecutor decides not to file charges where an arrest has been made doesn't indicate that there was necessarily a bad arrest. In fact, it's part of the natural give and take of the system. It shows, frankly, that the system's working well because prosecutors are exercising their discretion not to go forward on cases where an arrest has been made.
What are the police to do, though, if they're peacefully protesting and there's one or two bad actors that cause the police to make a decision that it's an unlawful assembly at that point?
I mean, you're asking about how law enforcement should respond in a hypothetical situation. I think law enforcement's focus here has been and should be on making sure that the public is safe, and that includes protecting the safety of the protesters who are exercising their First Amendment rights.
If these were bad arrests, what's your message to Tampa police about not doing this again?
Let's be clear, I'm not saying these are bad arrests. The fact that the arrests were made is a different decision than we make as prosecutors whether to go forward. I have had conversations with our law enforcement leaders, with Chief Dugan, with Sheriff Chronister, other police chiefs, as well as with the mayor. Again, we're glad to see that as the protests have continued, they've become more peaceful, that there have been fewer interactions between law enforcement and the protesters so that people can exercise those First Amendment rights peacefully.
Is this an apology to the protesters?
From whom?
From law enforcement, from all law enforcement entities?
You'd have to ask law enforcement entities.
From reviewing the evidence or information in these cases, do you feel, and this may be simply an opinion, that their First Amendment rights were violated or broken, so to speak, because of their arrest?
It's more of a civil question in terms of whether there was a violation of their rights. The way we review the evidence, we're looking to see if anyone was doing anything other than exercising those First Amendment rights. And as I've said before, there was no indication of violence, vandalism, destruction of property, attacks on a law enforcement officer that would give rise to an unlawful assembly charge or any other criminal charge.
Did you review any of the videos? I know some of the protesters posted some of the videos of that night.
I have.
Where are you on reviewing the rest of those 200 and some cases and what those folks be charged?
I can't comment on specific cases until I've actually reviewed the evidence or our office has. We've gone through the majority of roughly 120 misdemeanor and juvenile cases that were filed just in the first 4 days. So that's from Saturday, May 30th through Wednesday, June 3rd. There are an additional roughly 70 felony arrests that were made in that first week of protests. And that's just that first week. So we're continuing to diligently go through each one of those cases to make sure we've reviewed the evidence that we have, determine if there's additional evidence out there, and make the appropriate charging decision. Keep in mind, too, that in the COVID scenario that we are now, where a lot of these people are out of custody, we're not making filing decisions until we need to because we don't want to put more cases in the system at a time when our system has been dialed back a lot because of the pandemic. So even before the protests started, our office had been delaying in filing misdemeanor charges where defendants were out of custody until we have a chance to really review not just the initial police report, but additional evidence. Because, again, we're trying to manage the amount of cases that are coming into the system at a time when we're still not at full capacity.
So all the 67 people were arrested in June 2nd?
Correct. There were 67 arrests on the night of June 2nd for standalone unlawful assembly charges, meaning they weren't charged with any other offense that evening. All were made by Tampa Police Department. all were in the same vicinity of downtown. I think it was a few blocks away from here. It was closer to Broreen before the Platt Street Bridge.
So again, to clarify, the more egregious crimes, if you will, connected to the protests, your office is still looking at those, assault on LEO, that kind of thing?
Let me just make one distinction. I wouldn't say that those are connected with the protests in terms of its protesters. What we've seen are people peacefully protesting, and then there are other groups of people, or sometimes a very small percentage of the protesters who are committing crimes, such as destruction of property, assault on a police officer. I mean, we've seen the footage from Saturday night, May 30th, where you had a completely different group of people than the protesters who were out causing the rioting and looting and destruction of property. I mean, I think we were all shocked and disappointed when we saw part of our city burn that night.
There's been a lot of instances nationwide where peaceful protesters have kind of intervened on behalf of the peacefulness to stop that type of activity. Is there a message here for local peaceful protesters about maintaining the peacefulness and trying to identify when those other ne'er-do-well people come in and want to cause a problem?
Absolutely, but I don't think they need to hear that from me. If you've been at the protests, many of the protests that I've been at, to talk with protesters, the leaders have made that announcement. They're saying, we're here to peacefully protest. We're not going to put up with people doing, destroying property and throwing things, and we are here to be peaceful. And we've seen where protesters have sort of corralled other protesters to tell them that they're not going to tolerate any nonsense and criminal conduct. Absolutely.
I think for the media here, I think it's important to distinguish language. Language is important. Words are important. The protesters that are inciting violence are not protesters. Protesters are peaceful. And many of the questions that you all have asked have been using the language interchangeably, which I think is unwise and negligent in its use. Protesters are peaceful. Those individuals that do other things need to have other titles and terminology associated with them. Thank you.
Anything else?
Where will the event tonight be, and will public be allowed to attend that?
The event tonight will be at a local church in East Tampa. It's not open to the public. It's going to be with the church leaders discussing with the mayor. State attorney is going to be there. He's confirmed. The sheriff's office is in the process of confirming. They have confirmed. We have a city council member who's going to be in attendance, a Hillsborough County commissioner who will be in attendance to that meeting. And once again, that's only a launching pad to a long dialogue for us to gain repair in relations in our community with our leaders and our people. I estimate between 8 and 10. It is.
No sunshine laws will be violated.
The city attorney has already contacted us to ensure that the numbers of officials holding the same position, they can't exceed a certain number without violating Sunshine State law. Absolutely. It's a meeting with leaders of predominantly African-American congregations in the Tampa area. We're meeting with these leaders to start discussions to make sure that we can avoid and circumvent being the next city in the national news for a negative reason. We want to address several topics, not just about the protest, but ongoing. How can we ensure that all communities, especially communities of color, are being policed fairly? How can we increase diversity in our police force? How can we improve our educational system and economic disparities that exist in our communities where our churches are located? So it's a very wide ranging, comprehensive conversation that, as one pastor told me, you're not going to solve a 400-plus-year-old problem overnight. It's going to take time, but we got to do the work to engage our leaders and decision makers so that we can make substantive progress.
You should have a letter that you all should have received a letter about the meeting and the information, right, Chris? You said, so you should have that in your file somewhere.
You're
Pardon me?
Media is not.
No, I think the pastors said they didn't want any press tonight. They just want to meet with those elected officials who had a decision in terms of the protests and what's been happening. Yeah, they're it's about what, 60 pastors? About 60 pastors. Most of them are pastors of what I would say some of your predominant African American churches here in the community.
Is there any way to take pictures of the meeting and send it to the media outlets?
Pastor Roundtree, I don't know, they want to know if there a way a picture can be taken of the meeting or something to that effect. So this is
So the reason why we wanted it to be a closed meeting is because we don't want anyone to take this as a photo op to show that we're all singing Kumbaya and proclaiming that the victory is won. This is a hard, long process. And in the future, we do plan to have press conferences to share the things directly that we'll be discussing. But I think it's very important now that our leaders are held accountable by those who are on the ground, in the grassroots, and it's not a time for us to be celebratory or out in front of cameras. We want to make sure that we're actually getting some progress made, and I think that's how you reveal the true character of the people involved. Can we talk behind closed doors and get actual progress and commitments without the news media being present? There's a time for that because I think the public needs to know, and the public will be invited in the future. But starting out, this is our first meeting of this sort. I think it's very important that we engage in very, very honest and open, transparent conversation. Because the people that we're addressing, the decision makers that we're addressing, we want to address them in a closed environment, because when it's open, people tend to try and posture. There's platforms and grandstanding. We don't want any of that. And once again, at a proper time, we think the media is a great resource to use. But I think some of the best, most profitable meetings have occurred in private. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good. How are you?
Walking down, but there's a 1 p.m. That 1 p.m. Zoom with Reverend Russell Meyer today that Andrew has, and if you want to be on that. Yeah. So don't forget, 1 p.m. I didn't know if you wanted